Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if South Korea won the Korean War. In my last video I talked about the scenario in which North Korea could have won the Korean War and how the world would change with the North winning the Korean War. The North would become less radical and moderate over the time. Naturally, I also asked myself, what if the South won the Korean War? The Korean War was almost decided, one could say. The North pushed until the very tip of the Korean peninsula, and it was almost about to annex all of Korea, until the UN forces came and managed to break the North Korean lines. Only because of the Chinese support, North Korea still exists, and that's why they could be seen as a Chinese puppet, at least in one way or another. The Korean War marked a permanent division between the North and the South, and both states are a reminder of the Cold War period, the North being a former ally of the Eastern Bloc and the South an ally to the West. The US of course had a huge military presence in South Korea and still continues to do so, while North Korea has an army first doctrine and could rely on Chinese support in the past and also in the present timeline. There were some smaller incidents on the borders between the two. Sometimes there were also a few rapprochements, but realistically only a military solution could be seen as the option to unite the whole peninsula. Also, both states are still in a permanent state of war. There is no peace treaty between both, and both claim the whole Korean peninsula for themselves. So what if all of that changed? What if South Korea won the Korean War? For this timeline to work out, we could just assume that the Chinese would not support North Korea and see Kim Il-sung as delusional person. The Soviets, for instance, didn't support North Korea, so China might also have the same point of view in that alternate timeline, and North Korea would fall thus to the south, after the UN forces would get the needed support. Now, of course, much of Korea will be devastated and totally destroyed, perhaps even more so than in OTL. The Soviets would become somewhat nervous, as well as the Chinese of course, but they still felt the effects of World War II. As a result, the Soviets would only send something like a diplomatic protest note, but nothing more would come out of it. The US would promise them that they would not intervene in other areas and only do so because maybe another country attacked their ally first. And in that sense, the North, they attacked first the South, so the Soviets could not really argue against it. Korea will stay a poor country for a long time. Korea won't see a Wirtschaftswunder or economic miracle like in Western Germany or Japan or perhaps even Italy, for instance. This means that communism would still become a very attractive alternative to the poorer classes, and monetary, ideological and material support would come in from other communist countries. It is also possible that we would see communist terrorist attacks or an armed ring of the communist underground within Korea. This alternate Korea will, as a result, follow the same policies as South Korea and become even more anti-communist and more repressive as a result. South Korea winning the Korean War doesn't mean that we get a free and democratic Korea, no. Not at all actually, because in our timeline South Korea was for a very long time very much authoritarian, and even until nowadays certain laws and certain parts of South Korea are not that much democratic. Korea might even become more authoritarian than in OTL. Remember how the US supported dictatorships around Latin America, for instance. Well, with an economy somewhat similar as the ones of Latin America, at least by GDP for instance, Korea would see the same type of support from the US that was given to countries like Chile, for instance, under Pinochet. The Korean Chinese and Korean Soviet borders would become heavily armed to such an extent that the Soviets, well, they would prefer to send some of their troops to Vladivostok and even have bigger bases in that area. Korea would become an important ally to Japan, but only forcefully. The US would force both to have excellent relationships. Other allies might include Taiwan and the Philippines and South Vietnam, only for some time. Or maybe not at all. I will talk about Vietnam later on. Winning the Korean War would also mean that the US wouldn't go nuts. The US would still be anti-communist and follow the same policies as it did in OTL, but with slight moderations. The US might use a different approach in Vietnam, for instance. Instead of intervening and sending all their army forces in there fighting a long war, they might talk to the Soviets and perhaps come to an agreement with countries like France, also movements like the Viet Cong movement and other forces from the region and other states. As a result, Vietnam could become an Asian type of Yugoslavia, and Ho Chi Minh could become a Tito-like figure in that area. Also, this means that we will have no Pol Pot and other communist uprisings in that region, and it might even become a very stable region. The Soviets would not lose their face, the US would not have lost countless soldiers and wasted countless materials, and thus they could support Korea on a much larger scale. This means that despite the bigger devastation in the Korean War and the bigger size, Korea would see an improvement in the 70s or perhaps even in the end 60s already. This improvement, however, would only be from an economical point of view. And the people, they would start also to support the regime a little bit more, because finally they could get better jobs, they could build more things, they could consume more, so this would appeal to them to a certain way. There would be also less terrorist attacks by the communists, seeing how the regime would actually improve the conditions within Korea, but this doesn't mean that the communists will just disappear suddenly. No, actually the communists of Korea, they will try to take a different approach, and they would try to infiltrate certain administrations and certain other societal parts of this new Korea. In pop culture, the US stays much more conservative because of the absence of a Vietnam War. This means we will not get any hippie movements and also no anti-war movements. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis would still happen, and the same outcome would happen as in OTL. The Soviets as well as the Chinese would feel pressured by a strong US-influenced Korea, and we might see the Chinese putting some more emphasis in their military in Manchuria, while the Soviets, well, they would need to make certain choices. And they would actually have certain choices which would present themselves. One of the choice would be, do they need to send more troops to the east? Another choice would be, should they keep the same amount of soldiers and material and equipment in Eastern Europe? Should they sponsor the same movements as in OTL? Is this still an option? Or would they actually ruin their economy much faster if they try to do everything at the same time? If we get other figures and other leaders within the Soviet Union, we might also see a different direction and also a different approach, perhaps even leading to a Soviet Union that lasts for much longer. But one thing is for sure. The Soviets in general, they would face more problems, and if they continued the same policies as in OTL, well, at least with Brezhnev or perhaps even with Andropov, the Soviets might already see the first signs of collapse or already collapse, especially with Andropov's rule. They would just not be able to keep up with the spendings, and thus they would fail. The West as well as the East, they would change in unrecognizable ways. But let's stay first with Korea for now. The Korean economy would improve, and with the fall of the Soviets, the Chinese might see some economic troubles because the Soviets were actually some partners of them and also other allies of the Soviets. There would also be some type of global economic disruption. However, the Korean economy would still stay strong and endure this moment. However, without Moscow, the repressed communist movements, they would now try to influence Korean politics much more actively. A similar party as Die Linke, the left from Germany, might gain a huge track and huge influence in Korea. They will not get power in a more democratic Korea, but always have around the same percentage of votes, let's say like 10 to 20%. Because even in our timeline, the left of Korea is very powerful. And Korean society would then try to move more towards the left because they were just so tired of this military dictatorship that they had for such a long time. The traditional ally Japan and also the US would have less influence over Korea, and suddenly new problems would arise between them. And also with the absence of a bigger power like the USSR and also China still not being that strong as in OTL, Korea would suddenly also start to make demands towards Japan where they should pay more or they should revise certain aspects, they should apologize, which would be very, very problematic for both states. And even with the US being present in that area, wouldn't necessarily mean that Korea and Japan would suddenly just agree with each other. Quite the contrary. Korea might even go so far where they might even force the US to take back their troops, because after all there's no more danger. Will Korea then become an ally of China in the future, or will this new Korea fall back into a military dictatorship after having a huge backlash from the more right-wing parts and more traditional parts of the society? And that's where we leave it for now. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.